This is Bennett et al. In Science, Evidence of Humans in North America During the Last Glacial Maximum. And actually take my screen off for a moment because I'm not logged in there, but I'm going to pull up the PDF so we can show
the amazing pictures.
Some of the amazing pictures and some of what so here you can show my screen again. This is, again, published in Science this week, Evidence of Humans in North America During the Last Glacial Maximum. They are finding, because what they've done is they found footprints in modern day New Mexico that they can date to 23,000 years ago-ish. And as they say here, and what I've got highlighted, fossil human footprints provide an alternative source of evidence for human presence. Unlike cultural artifacts, modified bones, or other more conventional fossils, footprints have a primary depositional context and are fixed on the imprinted surface. All of that is science speak for actually we can date footprints with greater accuracy and precision than we can date many other types of evidence.
So I must say this is a million miles from either of our specialty. I do wonder, right? So that the history is that we have a earliest date on which we all agree for the presence of humans in North America, right? The Clovis people. And
early,
then
you don't mean early.
We have a farthest back in time date on which we all agree. It goes back at least this far.
At least
this far. And then there are all of these claims about evidence that go farther back. And these claims are very contentious. Some of them are stronger than others. Some of them are clearly nonsense.
Well, we actually open the book, like the very first chapter, right? It goes into the Beringians and the people in the Americas. And we say that we tend towards these earlier dates. Yep. But a conservative estimate is sometime between 10 and 30,000 years. That's a huge span. Sometime between 10 and 30,000 years ago, the Americas were peopled for the first time. But the evidence to our eyes has looked even before this like more than 20,000 years ago seems much more likely.
Right. And I should say there's some other remote contingencies which we should get rid of. Like there's the possibility that human beings landed in the Americas, went extinct. And so that could be true and have no implication whatsoever for the peopling of the Americas that matters from the point of view of all of the native cultures that were here. So anyway, that's a possibility.
There's also some people are still arguing for crossing the Pacific, right, as opposed to going through what is now submerged under the Bering Strait, but Beringia as a landmass that was a landmass for several thousand years.
Right. Nonetheless, so I do wonder about the security of the evidence here. Right. So it's possible that it's as secure as they're claiming, but it's also true that there are various processes that can confuse you. Right. So there's a process, for example, called reworking. Right. There are certain things like clams that will actually take material and in their excavation for their clam burrows will move it around. And so they can put things in the strata that it doesn't belong in, right?
But having a 2D, having what is effectively parietal, and that is not itself disrupted by such possible reworking seems to provide good evidence that this depositional site has not been reworked.
But what I want to know...
But again, we are outside of our
It may be
expertise.
That these folks know exactly what they're doing and they've ruled out every possibility. But imagine, for example, that footprints had been very, very shallow and that they had caused a difference in water to accumulate in versus outside of. In other words, water would run off the substrate where there was no footprint, and where there was a footprint, you would get extra erosion because of a positive feedback. Could a footprint work its way down into strata that weren't where it was made? I don't know. Hopefully these people have ruled that out, but
really far outside anything that we have done directly, but sort of, I think you are proposing a process a little bit like the fossilization of wood, or, fossilization at all at some level, just, replacement of the original material.
Just that a physical process could move, these are not going to be carbon dated, right? These are going to be dated by the strata in which the footprint is made, which seems to be unambiguous. And
I read it, but I don't remember what exactly the methods are here. I don't remember.
But anyway, there's what you want. This is, first of all, if this is true, for there to have been footprints 23,000 years ago in the Americas nails down, even if you never found another shred of evidence for it. The point is, if those footprints really are that old, then it says there were people to make those footprints then. So the point is, you want to be really sure that there is nothing that could conceivably have misled you about how old those footprints were before you decide, well, they were here 23,000 years ago, and that's just a simple fact. So anyway, we'll see whether the result holds up. But if it does, it has many, many implications, right?
One of which is, let me just read another little tiny bit from the paper. Ichnofossils of extinct late Pleistocene fauna occur widely on the margins of the playa and include tracks of Proboscidea, mammoth, Folivora, ground sloth, Carnivora, both canid and felid, and Cedardiodactyl, bovid and camelid, most of which are associated with human footprints. So we've got mammoths, ground sloths, wild dogs and cats of unspecified species, and both cowish things and camelids present in the same place as the footprints, which charismatic megafauna all. This puts humans there at the same time as they were abundant, which provides further evidence potentially for the idea that we helped hasten their extinctions.
Well, actually, I was wondering about whether it doesn't do exactly the opposite. Because, so if 23,000 years is a good date, then human beings were not facing the retreating ice sheets. They skirted under them or came across by ship.
Well, you're not arguing across by ship. You're talking about coastal route down by skin.
Well, I think that's, no. I'm leaving open the remote possibility of some other introductory mechanism from Asia.
Ship seems like a strange word here.
Boat.
Okay.
But the point is, the easiest model is there were people living in Beringia, which there were, and that population, as the waters rose, moved, right? And that some of them ended up in North America. If 23,000 years is the date, then it may be that
earlier, because New Mexico isn't, Olympia.
Right. Yeah. But it could be, could take 50 years to go that distance. There's not inherently a reason for people to move that fast. But the point is, moving during the glaciated period is certainly possible. It suggests certain routes and not others, right? It narrows down the likely mode of passage, and it puts people in North America not at exactly the moment of the elimination of many of these megafauna, if I understand it correctly. And so one of the pieces of evidence that people point to with respect to the human overhunting hypothesis, which to me is very plausible because these animals would have had no experience with human hunting and therefore would have behaved the way we see creatures behave in the Galapagos, where they don't run away from you, for example, right? They would have been easy prey and therefore easily hunted out. But I believe this would interface with that and suggest that it isn't such a tight correlation in time. I'd like to know better whether or not that's accurate.
I think the strongest evidence that I've seen against the extinction of the North American megafauna, charismatic megafauna, not being due to humans has been that at least Clovis first suggested, if I've got my dates right, that humans basically showed up after the extinctions after at least some of the extinctions had already happened or were already clearly on the decline. So it was sort of like Pizarro and company arrived on Mayan shores and yes, killed them off, but the Maya were already in decline at that point.
Yeah.
And so this has people present well before we have any evidence that the charismatic megafauna populations were already in decline, suggesting that it is possibly our existence here is possibly causal.
All right, interesting. Well, we should talk to some of our paleo friends and see how this actually plays out.
Indeed. Now, did you want me to show some of these images from this
it's worth
paper?
seeing them. I was pretty impressed.
Zachary? So we're talking about modern New Mexico, of course, and here we have these images for those only listening of some of the footprints that these authors are finding. And they really are, as tends to be the way with footprints, as opposed to a lot of other kinds of archaeological and paleoanthropological evidence, footprints tend to look like footprints.
Yeah.
They're really compelling in a way. Like parietal art is often very compelling. That is to say things like cave drawings. But a lot of, potsherds and such often is not compelling unless you already know what you're looking for. But footprints footprints do something for the sort of the visceral brain and body of the person, of the modern observing them.
Yes, when I went to look at the paper, I was expecting not to be terribly convinced by the pictures, which doesn't mean that they're not footprints, but I was expecting to have to take their word for it that that's what they were. And I was like, oh, no,
exactly.
I'm compelled. Those do look like footprints.
Yeah, very much so. Okay, so this is amazing. This is amazing discovery on the part of the researchers. And it also represents discovery of a geographic frontier on the part of the people who laid down those footprints. And we in the book, and we've talked about this previously on this podcast and elsewhere, and it's in the book, talk about these three types of frontiers that humans have historically encountered: geographic frontiers, technological frontiers, and transfer of resource frontiers, the latter of which is a form of theft and is immoral. Human history, though, is full of these moments of geographic discovery, of, however it is and whenever it was that the first Americans arrived on the shores of America, be it 10,000 years ago, seems not, 20,000 years ago, probably not, 25, 30,000 years ago, maybe. Whenever that was discovery. That was, there was a moment at which people first set foot on this landmass that offered 2 continents worth of opportunity. And because geographic discovery tends to come so early in human history, it doesn't tend to come with texts. These aren't people who are writing things down by and large. We have later people showing up and thinking they've discovered things, who have writing and who write about those things, but those are transfer of resource frontiers, right? The Spaniards coming to the New World were not engaged in geographic frontiersism. They were engaged in transfer of resource frontiersism, whether or not they knew that or not. Some of them presumably quickly did come to know that, and many of them presumably did not.
Columbus discovered Americans.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. So because history, the way that history is taught, and history even, I was shocked when I learned this, and I was well into adulthood when I learned that actually history understands itself to be the study of the written texts of what humans have left behind. And anything before that is called prehistory. Well, because history is biased in this way, and a bias it is, it's going to vastly underrepresent geographic frontiers and what happens when humans come upon them and how they explore in that space. And of course, it's what paleoanthropologists do and archaeologists, and it's part of what we are doing in the book and in our thinking, is trying to figure out how it is that humans have engaged in discovery, even as, at this point in time, there is almost nothing left to be discovered, at least on this planet, with regard to geographic frontiers. So that bias in history, because of its bias on texts, will steer us away from deep history. It'll steer us away from stories of non-literate people. And as has often been noted, it's going to be more likely to reflect the tales of the victors of wars, or the otherwise privileged, for whatever reason, that they were the ones able to tell their stories, not just tell their stories, but write down their stories and have those written archives make it into the future, which is to say the now.
I would just point out that this interfaces with the guns, terms, and steel analysis, because the idea is the cultures that are likely to win when 2 cultures come into conflict are the ones that have slight advantage by being a few hundred years ahead, technologically speaking, and those are likely to be ones that do have also the capacity to write a description of what took place.
Precisely. And it's one of the reasons that what happened to the Maya is so, it's always going to be tragic, but it's particularly tragic because they did have written language, and they did have libraries, and we can imagine that they had extraordinary histories and scientific textbooks, and I don't know if they would have called them textbooks, but they had astronomy, they had the concept of zero, they had roads and city-states and politics and just extraordinary stuff. And one of the things that the Spaniards did is they destroyed it. So we're left basically with a tiny bit of those things that were inscribed on pyramids, and we're not left with the library.
Well, we have one text that was written on some other material, but the rest of it was burned. That which was flammable was burned. Yeah. And
that's a transfer of resource frontier right there. Part of what you do is you destroy the history that comes before, so as to obscure it.
Well, and I would just in passing point out that whatever that instinct is that causes a population to actually, instead of preserving the relics of populations that they have run across to destroy them, right? That is some sort of an evolutionary lineage against lineage instinct, and we are seeing it. We are watching, right, the destruction of...
It's one of the reprehensible evolutionary instincts.
It's a reprehensible evolutionary instinct that we are seeing within our own culture, right? Yes. The tearing down of statues, the fact that the elk statue in Portland, was successfully removed by crazy people who, obviously couldn't possibly have had a complaint about, the abhorrent views of elk, because they don't presumably have any abhorrent views.
You may underestimate the people and their views on the abhorrent views of elk.
Yes. But in any case, the point is the instinct to be tearing down statues of Lincoln and whatever elk happen to be memorialized in your city and all of that is this ancient instinct to destroy something as you take power and overwrite the prior history. So we should be aware it's unfolding, and we can, you can zoom in too close and think it's about something that it really isn't.
Yes, absolutely. So, so many places we could go here, but I guess one of the things that I wanted to get to was to say that actually Zachary, our producer here, our older son, has had several extraordinary history teachers. And I want to point out that, that what I'm about to say is not true of all of the ways that history is being taught now, but we also know of more than one high school history class, for instance, we've heard tell, where the focus is entirely on that third type of frontier that we just talked about. So not on geographic frontiers for this sort of reason, this bias that's built into history where it doesn't talk about those things which haven't been written down, but also not on technological frontiers, wherein humans with their ingenuity make more of some resource than what was possible before the technological innovation. But instead of focus entirely on these transfer of resource frontiers, which are not a legitimate form of frontier, they are theft. And certainly it has happened a lot. There has been a lot of land theft, for instance, in human history. But rather than exploring the diversity of types of frontiers that humans have engaged in, or talking about how technological innovation, for instance, has allowed people to make systems that are functional for some period of time, instead we have increasingly, with the ideology that is spreading in modern history classrooms, many of them, not all of them, a focus entirely on theft. And I know you want to talk a little bit about exactly a form of theft that seems to be happening right now, but be it land theft or resource theft or people theft in the form of slavery, it's a real part of human history to be sure, but it's not the only part. And also this excuses nothing, but very often the people who were being robbed of their land had themselves dispatched whoever came before them. And so, we have this sort of noble, savage view of people who came before and who had their land stolen from them. And the people who were doing the stealing are supervillains, and the people who had the land stolen from them are somehow perfect. And frankly, that's a fairly racist view of those people as well. Every civilization that has left a mark has engaged in some combination of cooperation and competition. This, again, is a theme of the book, right? Every single one of us and every single civilization that's left any sort of mark has engaged in both of these things, cooperation and competition. Are some civilizations more brutal than others? For sure, and some less. But pretending that land theft or resource theft or people theft is the only thing worth talking about in human history, that is both a sign of your own privilege to be able to talk about that to the exclusion of all of the wondrous things that humans have done. But it also creates in children, the children who are receiving these lessons, a sense of futility. It's actually a kind of, I'm just going to say, it's a kind of child abuse to teach children over and over and over again that land theft is the thing that has been what has happened in human history, and to not talk about the glorious things and the technological frontiers and the geographic frontiers and the ways that we have learned to get along with one another and to merge and to flourish.
Well, it also, I think, most troublingly, creates no path forward.
Precisely.
Right? So if you were to say, well, what we should do is we should restore everything to the people from whom it was stolen, you can't. right? The point is you will have to stop arbitrarily. The people who are present are not the people from whom something was stolen. There's just no mechanism where you could operationalize anything useful. And I think it is important to say, first time I heard a declaration about stolen land, I was actually favorable to it. I thought, you know what, this is an important recognition, right? This is a historical recognition and a useful one. But the obligation to it, the motivation, has become so pathological. And what it doesn't do is focus on the one answer that addresses all of that theft, right? The one answer is to take what we've got, stabilize it, make what we're doing sustainable, and democratize it so everyone has access. And people will make different amounts of it. But the point is, the really abhorrent thing is that opportunity is so far from equal, right? That's the place the focus should be. The way we ended up here is some story that is going to be arbitrary depending upon how far back you want to look. And so anyway, while we are dicking around with this stupid, guilt-driven, obnoxious mechanism, we are, allowing the destruction to continue. And we are running out the clock while we really have a lot to do with respect to making the place continually viable for the next 500 or 1,000 years.
That's right. I mean, it looks like there were people in modern New Mexico 23,000 years ago. How glorious. How amazing. How did they get there? What decisions can we imagine they made that got them there? What technological innovations did they make while they were there that allowed them to persist? These are the sorts of questions that I want to be exploring, and I want my children to be exploring, and I want everyone who's interested in the human condition and both history and future to be exploring. Not just, were they displaced at some point later? Were their descendants displaced wrongfully? Yeah, they were. That's one piece of their story. It's one piece.
Yeah, and our book talks about the mechanism by which people figure out how to switch niches. I would recommend, though, and we recommend in the book, 1491, which describes the world in the Americas just before Columbus arrived in the New World, right? And this, I've called it the greatest story never told. And the idea is all of that niche switching produced this incredible diversity of cultures and insights and innovations. And if there's one thing we can say about them, we know that they happened completely independently of the correlated stuff that happened in the old world, because there was no contact between the old and the new world, right?
The Mayan Enlightenment happened well before, many hundreds of years before the European Enlightenment. And
it really is, it's not an exact match, but it's a rough match for essentially the Greeks. And you can make an argument that the Inca were similar in their own way to the Romans. That you have this parallelism, and these discoveries, which are very human in their nature, the way they come about is part of this process. And most of us don't know anything about it, right? So anyway, 1491 is a great way to dive in and have some sense of what the Americas looked like before Europeans came, and it isn't what you've been taught, right? It's an amazing diversity, and highly recommend it.
That's right. Yeah, and that book, 1491, Charles C. Mann, I believe is his name, wrote a shorter piece, and I can't remember if it was Harper's or the Atlantic. That is a great starting point too. If you don't want to do the whole book, it's a big book.